What are the main motivators for CSPs to embrace open source? And where does OpenStack fit in a multi-cloud and increasingly cloud-native world? Well, joining me here at the OpenStack Summit in Berlin, I have 4 industry guests, 2 CSPs, which is always great on a panel discussion like this, especially as we are focusing on CSPs. On my far right here, Allwyn Sequiera from VMware. Good to see you again, Allwyn. Next to Allwyn is Amy Wheelus of AT&T. Hello, Amy. Next to Amy is Beth Cohen of Verizon. And next to Beth is John Antonio of IDX. Can we start by just picking up on what I've just said about CSPs and embracing open source? I mean, first of all, why? Why should CSPs be interested in open source? Amy, perhaps you'd like to start.
I think open source, by virtue of being open, it brings more customers to CSPs. It provides for more opportunity, and if you can be in an open environment where you are collaborating across companies, across organizations, it gives you more opportunity to use multiple CSPs, to use more opportunities, spread out geographically. The more interoperability there is, the better.
Great. And Beth?
For us, it's really all about interoperability and integration. So that's something that traditionally the CSPs have not really understood that's what we are. And so, open source is a way for us to really embrace that and really expand across the community, across our customers, across our vendors, and of course, across between us, between the CSPs themselves.
And John, what would your advice be to CSPs?
So we work with service providers in our jurisdiction in Canada and outside North America. And one of the things that we've noticed is that open source is offering more choice. Right? There's really been at least a lot of the feedback we get is the lock-in strategy that has historically been in play with a lot of the traditional manufacturers of technology that carriers have utilized. So open source is offering, at least enforcing, more variety, more change. I think it's disconnecting the lock-in strategy. So I think it's a great opportunity.
And Allwyn,
Yeah, from our perspective, there's clearly untold advantages with open source. It brings the whole community together. It's self-selecting. You get the best of capabilities. And especially when you have a consortium, as for example, put together by the OpenStack with the CSPs, with the technologists, with the contributors, it does take you to a different level. How else could you have brought together compute and storage and networking with an open ecosystem, tackling all the main issues du jour from the CSP perspective, and then from a realization perspective too. So there's definitely a case to be made for open source today and ongoing.
And I'd like to add a point, which is agility. It's all about agility today, right? Building systems faster, better, adding features, bringing products to market that much faster, and open source really facilitates that very well.
we did a survey at Telecom TV just recently about, and asked CSPs about open source, and one of the really surprisingly high responses we got was that it puts CSPs in a driving seat in terms of network transformation and progress. And I just find it quite surprising to have that linkage between going the open source path and getting it into a more of a leadership position. Whether or not that's true of like your tier 1 telcos and all the way down to tier 3 telcos.
I think it drives innovation, number one. There's a lot of debate whether or not it's the best vehicle for creating innovation, but I think it's caused change. And that change has had a ripple effect on the industry, and I think it's benefiting not only the providers of service, but the consumers of the service that the CSPs are offering. So more choice.
I think it opens the ecosystem. The ecosystem, especially in the telecommunications and cloud area, was very closed and very locked with big, large players for many, many years. And as we've gone to an open environment, it's opened that ecosystem up, and smaller players have an ability to come in and be, disruptors and change agents and help with that transformation.
Well, and I think it's also changed the dialogue between the vendors and the CSPs themselves. It used to be sort of one-to-one dialogue with each of the vendors, but we were saying the same thing over and over again. And so here within the open source community, we can really spread the word. Yeah, we are looking for a tool that does this. And you know what? AT&T is looking for the same tool.
Exactly.
Now, this is the OpenStack Summit, so OpenStack is one aspect of open source. So, Owen, where does OpenStack fit in maybe in the importance to CSPs?
Correct. I think where OpenStack began a few years ago, where it's today, are two slightly different things. I think the initial genesis of OpenStack, the CSPs were fed up with proprietary stacks, vendor leverage, and were looking for a more open playing field where you could bring a lot of things together. So in the initial conceptualization of OpenStack, I think to a certain extent, VMware represented the proprietary version. OpenStack represented an open variant of the same virtualization software-based platform. Over time, OpenStack has come to be a lot of things, all the way down to virtual infrastructure management, the service interfaces, the orchestration, the automation, etc., a whole bunch of tools. So today I look at it as it's brought to fore a whole bunch of technologies. Some parts not so good, some parts very good. The ecosystem aspects, the integration aspects, wonderful. The things that have not quite panned out, it's very hard to go build a world-class virtualization platform in an open source community. For example, VMware spends $1 billion in software on getting the world's best hypervisor, network virtualization, storage virtualization. However, VMware loves the OpenStack on top of it because that brings together the entire ecosystem. So I think there's a balance between what is truly open, what is curated, what is prescriptive, versus what's thrown open to the community to go develop and bring to a fore in a given CSP.
What do our CSPs think? Is that fair, this balance?
Yeah, I would say that's the case. I mean, OpenStack has just recently announced that it's open infrastructure, yes, right? So a move away from sort of that data center focus and understand that infrastructure is in the open source community is extremely important. And so OpenStack has that role. You're right. OpenStack's not reinventing hypervisors anytime soon. But it still has that kit of parts that the entire open source community needs.
Right. I mean, it is really a framework that stitches all these things together. It's complicated. I mean, it's one of the things that we found is that tier ones like yourselves have the luxury of having a lot of horsepower behind driving those initiatives. We work a lot with tier 2 and tier 3 operators, which are struggling because their expectations were that it was a little closer to push button, and it's not. And a lot of them have focused primarily on deploy and have forgotten about the fact that the real important stuff happens in the second day and from that point forward, and how do you actually deal with those consequences of that decision. So the more contributors hopefully are going to get smarter about how to actually make it closer to that push button mentality.
Do we have a responsibility as a community to kind of keep drawing the tier 2s and 3s into this to make sure they're not excluded?
Absolutely. I think you have to have a robust ecosystem of contributors, of providers, of vendors. All of that is important in the whole framework of what we're doing. OpenStack is an infrastructure play. It is as you said, a framework, and it's not something that everybody can take and do on their own. There's a whole new realm of market for integrators such as yourself and other people who can come in and help those tier 2, tier 3, tier 4 plays. But what we need to, in my opinion, in the OpenStack world, we need to create, and I'm going to tilt it towards my NFV world a little bit, but is how do we standardize somewhat on some infrastructure standards so that we can help drive those applications that are coming on top of it to be more easily associated and make it easier to put those workloads on our cloud.
Well, and I think the work by ONAP and the OPNFE and the Linux Networking Foundation is really moving in that direction.
Absolutely.
And all the top tier providers are participating, as well as middle and downstream tier providers. So that orchestration automation infrastructure ties into the real gap, which is the operations side. I've been harping on that for years, and both of us have lived the pain.
Right. Yeah, ironically, for us too, OpenStack, while it initially started out to be this generalized SDDC, software-defined data center, increasingly we are seeing, and for example, within VMware, we've targeted most of our OpenStack efforts towards NFV and VNFs. And so I completely resonate with the NFV workspace having something like OpenStack platform as a driver. And from our standpoint, the very next bastion of innovation needs to come from taking the OpenStack, taking the ecosystem, and making it a great place to integrate in a very holistic fashion the VNFs. Because that's what it's all about, the specialized workloads sitting on top of the NFVs, which in turn sit on top of the network. So there are really two contexts for OpenStack. One is inside the data center, serving up compute and cloud and agile compute and storage, versus the networking use cases where it's about VNFs sitting on top of the network. And increasingly, I think as a community, we need to spend more energy on optimizing OpenStack specifically for those environments.
Right. And as I mentioned earlier, the operations piece has been long the stepchild of OpenStack.
Oh, yeah. Well, I would make the argument that the vision of what OpenStack and the virtualization of the network and NFV and VNFs and all of that was really the ability to actually see that vision come to reality is the ability to orchestrate. I kind of use the analysis that we've got a lot of dancers out there, but we need someone that can actually make them all work in unison, right? Because we're talking about some things that are incredibly complex, and we've got the capability with this technology to actually do things in terms of service delivery and services that we can deliver that haven't even been envisioned yet. That's where the potential really lies, and from our vantage point.
I think one of the things that is always, when there is so much potential out there, it's a risk that you want to go do all the very complex things first. And I think we need to step back a minute and say, let's do some of the simple things first and get some of those simple capabilities there, and then we can build on that.
Yay to that.
Amen. You know, I think exactly right. NFV, VNF, simple things like automated life cycle of the VNF's day 0, day 1.
Well,
but
that
as
sounds simple, but it's not.
And why is that?
Well, and we get into the situation where I kind of use the analogy, it's the technologist's shiny ball syndrome. There's so many new things going out there, and we're seeing what happened, at least we're observing, right? So OpenStack, you know, the half-life of open source technologies by itself is very, very short. It's getting shorter, it seems. And today now the big theme is we're talking edge, we're talking containers. So all of a sudden OpenStack, which used to be the dominant theme at these conferences, is now starting to weigh because of these other things are starting to come in place. And we haven't even perfected the OpenStack infrastructure ecosystem yet, and we're already potentially moving into new stuff, which is even more complicated,
I
more
see
moving
that
parts.
as just a different use case for OpenStack. I don't see that as something different. I see it as an extension and a use case. You know,
It's a superset.
it is. It's a superset. That's good.
But there's even arguments about whether or not is it Kubernetes working on top of OpenStack, or is it OpenStack working on top of Kubernetes?
Watch my
right?
panel,
So,
obviously,
right?
and the answer is yes.
Yes. Upstairs and downstairs.
Yeah.
North and south.
Well, I know we can do it either way.
Well,
but I'm
no,
saying it
you
just
will
becomes
do it either
yeah,
way.
Please.
Yeah.
Let's move on to how the environment and this world is changing. Shiny new toys, there's a great analogy there, but we as industry are also moving into multi-cloud. We're also talking about we've been talking about cloud native for some time, but it seems in the last 6 months the volume of that discussion has increased dramatically. We're even hearing now about cloud native network functions. And what exactly does that mean? How do you define all that?
Our operations people are quaking in their boots right now.
I bet they are. But how does OpenStack fit into this new world then?
It's
Is it still all up for grabs?
It's the foundation.
Yeah.
It's the base and the foundation for that we put that on, it resides on, and building that dependable, predictable lifecycle management type capabilities within OpenStack, like Airship delivers, those types of lifecycle management tools, those are critical to being able to deliver for those VNFs, those critical network functions, and as we give them more reliability, more dependability, more predictability, they're going to be more willing to operate in a cloud-like fashion. This is kind of a dance with us in the operations side. You know, it's like, they're all from the state of Missouri, the show me state.
Yeah.
Show me
they
it
are.
works.
Right, but for them, it's been a culture shift. I mean, a significant shift in technology. So we found that we've ended up having to re-engineer all our alarming systems because they're all basically assume there's a box at the end, and maybe there is box, or maybe there's a box with a bunch of other stuff in it.
Yeah, one of the nice things about OpenStack, it to a certain extent is future-proof from the standpoint in its initial incarnation. There were VMs, which became VNFs. Tomorrow, if they're CNFs, tomorrow if they're CNFs on bare metal, a lot of the constructs in the OpenStack world are still long. We should be very careful not to immediately do a side turn, a 90-degree turn away from something that's beginning to show signs of, it's the hype cycle. We are in the trough of disillusionment, just to the point when it's beginning to work, and then we'll wake up on the other side and things will be good again.
But OpenStack is working. I mean, we always forget there's what, 10 million cores out there, and so every major and small telecom is running OpenStack.
I have over 200 regions.
Yeah, so OpenStack is there. Part of the reason why I think it's gotten away from that sort of focus on OpenStack is because it's a solved problem. We don't talk about Linux anymore, and there's billions of instances of Linux out there.
Yeah, so maybe the dialogue should really be, it's not the shift from VMs to CNFs or VNFs to CNFs, it's VNFs and CNFs both running and coexisting in the context of an OpenStack platform and absorbing Kubernetes as, I think if we change that dialogue, people think it's a statement of a replacement. It's an and, it's not a or a but.
It's an evolution.
And I think it's also, is there enough staying power in the industry as a whole to not abandon it when it starts to get a little rough? Because it's been a little rough, and maybe less so for you guys because you've been doing it longer and you've got a much bigger environment.
No.
But I can tell you that we get a lot of
the rough.
Yeah, we get a lot of.
Started earlier with the rough.
We get a lot of pushback, and then it goes to this trough of disillusionment. Gartner philosophy, which is there's another term. I think it's in the crypto space, which is like basically hanging on for dear life while the thing plunges, right? We got people hanging on for dear life to see it get through this period, and the maturity level is there, and I agree with you, it's working.
3 years ago, I would not have stood on a stage and attempted to delete a VM and bring it back with a live call up. I wouldn't have done that 3 years ago. But I had to have confidence that it was going to work to be able to do that. I mean, it's working. It works today.
So this is a fascinating discussion. We could go on forever. But as we bring it to a head, one of the other interesting bits from our recent survey was that, and we looked at a lot of tier 2 operators for this, about 75% of them said there were too many open source projects for them to really fully get their heads around and engage with. So what's your advice to those CSPs who are looking at this daunting array before them, and what motivates them to keep getting involved? I mean, we've got to keep everyone involved. So what's your advice to those CSPs with regards to open source? Get involved now. Do as much as you can. Sit back and let the big tier 1s do all the work.
No. I think what the smaller companies can really offer, all of the companies, if you think about it, even the tier 1s, there's limited resources to devote to this. And what the vendors and the community really needs is use cases and requirements. That's something that OpenStack has always struggled with because it started out of the developer community, and it really, now I think we have a pretty good ecosystem, but there's always need for more help.
Yeah, I think the one point that I would look to the community to think about in the second phase of its existence. In the first phase, it was run, innovate. I think we've come to realize there are lots of forks in the road, many dead ends. We got to clean up the thing, come up with the next version, either deprecate or let go of the things that did not quite work. There's too many choices. I can't tell you how many customers I've talked to, some of the tier 2s, tier 3s in other places that went down one of the wrong forks, not the lasting forks. You're sitting here on the right side of things that worked, albeit, like you said, with lots of bodies and people and investments. folks on the road, I can tell you, people are stranded on older versions of OpenStack with no place to get from there because it's too old to, rock and roll, too young to die kind of a environment sitting out there.
I've heard rumors that Mercado Libre is still at Cactus.
Yes. Yes. So this is a problem that we as an industry have got to bring everyone to the version that we all collectively think is now hit the next level of maturity, maybe create a major point, and we encourage the entire ecosystem to move that to that point, because if we don't do that, we have all these stranded resources out there with lots of failed projects, if you will, that need
Right, but those middle tier people can really, they can reinforce what we're doing because, they have the same problems.
Oh, it's absolutely, it's just scale. It's really what we're dealing with.
And open source is here to stay. I mean, we're not going to go back to a world of proprietary software, proprietary building. That's not going to happen. And we have been the leaders out there. The larger companies have been the leaders out there. But the other companies are coming along, and like I said earlier, it's that whole ecosystem that allows for expansion for integrators and things to come bring them along.
Brilliant. Well, Amy, Beth, John and Allwyn, thank you all very much indeed for joining us today on Telecom TV.
Thank you.